in the Learning from the Expert series will be available on NYSERDA's website at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for a Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions for our speaker, and we'll get to them at the end. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goals of 70% renewable sources of electricity by the year 2030 and 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select Learning from the Experts speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you would like to suggest a topic or a speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter. Next slide, please. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Carrie Cullen Hitt. Kerry is the Executive Director of the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, which is dedicated to the advancement of offshore wind in the U.S. With a base funding of $41 million from the Department of Energy and NYSERDA, and additional contributions from 4 states and multiple industry stakeholders, the consortium advances innovation and technology. So prior to joining the consortium, Kerry was president of the New Hampshire Transmission Company, a regulated subsidiary of NextEra Energy Resources. She has also held several positions in solar and battery storage market development at NextEra Energy Resources. From 2008 to 2014, Kerry was a senior vice president of the Solar Energy Industries Association and president of the Solar Alliance. So we're super excited to have Kerry with us today. And welcome, Kerry. So without further ado, I will pass over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leila. Great. Thanks again for having me here today. I really appreciate it. And again, my name is Carrie Cullen Hitt, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Offshore Wind R&D Consortium. I know many folks who pay attention to the work that NYSERDA does in the state of New York are familiar with the consortium, but I thought I'd just take a moment and talk a little bit more about our structure and our members, and then we'll talk about some of the research that we're doing. There'll be ample time for questions at the end, and I hope you will ask questions. I'm much more comfortable answering questions than giving an extremely long talk. So please, submit them, and we'll respond to those in kind. So as Leila said, we are a not-for-profit, a standalone not-for-profit that is nationally focused, really focused on innovation and research to help reduce the levelized cost of offshore wind in the U.S. We also focus on maximizing the other economic and social benefits that we hope to experience in the offshore wind industry. Our desired impacts are innovations that are responsive to technical and supply chain barriers faced by offshore wind developers, to build strong networks connecting technology innovators, investors, and industry, and to increase U.S. content and job opportunities. As was previously mentioned, significant initial funding came from NYSERDA as well as the Department of Energy. In addition, we do have other states, now up to 5, New Jersey, Maine, Massachusetts, Virginia, and Maryland, all who provide cost share to our projects. And we also secure some membership dues from some of the entities I'm going to speak about in just a moment. We're very focused on actively procuring additional research funds from both public and private sources to help continue the research into offshore wind innovation. In addition, we're thinking about additional programs that will be put in place in 2022 and beyond. They include joint industry partnerships, providing consultation to entities with similar missions, and providing aid to other state and federal grant programs related to our mission or seeking those out. Members of the consortium include developers, manufacturing, the state agencies from the states that I just mentioned, other research institutions, and utilities. And if we go to the next slide, please. This is just an example of some of our members. You can see we have a wide variety of participants, including Ørsted and Equinor and Avangrid and Vineyard, also some of the states, Virginia and Maryland, the Electric Power Research Institute, GE Renewable Energy, Hitachi Energy, the New York Power Authority. So we really have a wide range of interests in the offshore wind space that cover both manufacturing, component parts, power systems, state leads, as I mentioned, as well as utilities. And can we please go to the next slide? As I said, one of our missions is to really collaborate across the U.S. And this map just shows some of the institutions that help identify the challenges in offshore wind that we need to tackle. Also, we collaborate with them on ideas for solutions for those. And many of the institutions that you see identified here have applied for grants for us and have been successful, or they're sitting on our research and development advisory group, which, as I said, helps us, map out, and I'm going to speak to our roadmap in just a minute, some of the challenges that we face. They also might help us score projects and things of that nature. So we really seek partnerships, whether they be formal or informal, with a number of research and academic institutions. As you can see, there are many here in New York and up and down the East Coast, but we're also, as I said, a national organization, and we do have partners in Texas and out in California. In addition, which isn't shown on this map, we do have some partnerships with entities overseas, including Innovate UK, which is based in England, or the UK, excuse me. And we are soon to announce a small collaboration with the Danish Technical University. But we also have some informal relationships with other institutions overseas that have either already have deployed offshore wind, and we have much to learn from them. So we seek to often collaborate just on ideas and what research things we might pursue. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is a chart that just shows what we expect for deployment. And I know many folks are probably familiar with this already. And I should mention they do not include the latest New York Bight announcements that were made last week. I just didn't have time before submission to include those. But it's important here to see kind of what the framework looks like. And you can imagine that the scope of this will be much grander now that we have New York Bight assigned and Oregon Bight auctions were announced. The Oregon BOEM and auctions were announced as well. And I'm sure we'll see more West Coast activity soon, as well as Gulf states. But here you can see that where things are in different stages, operating, we have very few operating assets here in the US. We have a number of megawatts in the permitting stage, and the total pipeline as of this chart was 32,000 megawatts, which is quite significant. And that size and scope presents a significant challenge to us here in the US, because the goals that we've stated from the states and from the federal government, from the Biden administration, are to really achieve these megawatts in the next 10 or 15 years, which means we have to build an industry in the US very quickly and very efficiently to keep costs down. So that's what the consortium is trying to do, is help the players in this market really think about what innovations we can have to deploy quickly, but also to deploy in a cost-effective manner. Let's go to the next slide, please. Some of the challenges, I apologize because it looks like some of the headlines or the formatting was lost. So this slide is meant to show kind of what are the major challenges that we've identified in offshore wind. One is, and these aren't in particular order, but I'll enumerate them to be helpful so we can follow along. One is grid access. In order to accommodate interconnection of offshore wind, we expect a grid access to have to increase 2 times what it currently is. So those are actual interconnections. We also have to be able to integrate these projects, which means we might have to have system upgrades and other sorts of things to make sure that the power we're producing offshore can actually be delivered to where it's needed. This is not a unique challenge to offshore wind, but obviously the goals exacerbate the challenge there. All of these things are solvable, but we do want to highlight what they are. Next is growth in battery and hydrogen storage, which can be really great for increasing efficiency and capacity. How do we incorporate that at a scale that's much more significant than it is today? Increasing the pace of floating technology advancements as we face increased water depth. So as we move to places like off the coast of California and even the Gulf of Maine, water depth grows significantly. And it's viewed that, of course, the technical solution to increased water depth is floating technology, which has not been used very much elsewhere in the world yet. So this will be really a first time for deployment of floating technology. And so a number of advancements are needed to make sure that we can meet the goals in those areas where water depth is deeper and floating technology is the solution for deployment. Another challenge is to reduce uncertainty in quantifying wind resources, meta-ocean design basis, and climate change impacts. So analysis on all of these factors is needed to ensure that we have efficient systems and systems that can withstand different ecosystems. Next, building a domestic supply chain. And for anyone paying attention to the offshore wind industry, we know that supply chain is really important because we're not only trying to deploy new energy resources, but we're also trying to build an industry. And building an industry means we need to have a supply chain here in the US. It's expected that supply chain will be a capital investment of over $100 billion. How are we going to make that happen? How do we ensure that we have what's called serial manufacturing and industrialization to supply the needs of the US market, and to do as much of that in the US as we can? Another major challenge is looking at inter-array wakes and blockages. And by this, we mean when you have multiple offshore wind systems that are going to be structured in kind of the same area, let's say the New York Bight, each of those systems might have an impact on the other one. And so analysis needs to be done on how they might impact each other so that we can design systems to reduce those impacts and ensure we get the capacity and efficiencies that we need from them. Next is large machines. As the offshore wind industry grows, and even the land-based industry, the size of the turbines and nacelles has grown significantly. That means further down the line, we have to think about what are the logistics for getting those larger turbines out to sea? What are the logistics of getting the component parts out to sea? Can the component parts actually accommodate much larger turbines? And the answer is yes, but innovation and technology improvements need to be there to make sure that that can happen in a timely manner. And then finally, and not least of which, are any environmental and scientific needs and social science needs. And for the consortium, we think about these things in terms of technology and hardware and innovation to aid scientific research. We don't actually, at this point, fund baseline scientific research. That's being done by a number of different organizations. But we are trying to work with those research to see how we can provide innovations and tools that will help them do the job of collecting that important data and doing the analysis that's needed. And can we go to the next slide, please? So the consortium, one of the ways that we've taken all those challenges and kind of thought about them in a more methodical way, in a more thorough way, is to issue a roadmap. And over the past 4 years, we've issued one about every 12 to 18 months, the most recent of which was Roadmap 3.0, issued last year. You'll note here on the bottom, I give credit to Walt Musil, who is one of our technical advisors and one of the leading thinkers in offshore wind. He's at the National Renewable Energy Lab at NREL. And Walt really helped us put this roadmap together. And what I'm going to walk through next are some of the challenge areas, we call them pillars, that are identified in the roadmap. And we use the roadmap to help guide what challenges we see, and then, to issue competitive solicitations or other activities to try to find solutions for those challenges. I should say that the roadmap is really derived from conversations that we have with some of the institutions I showed you on the map earlier, but also many people that work in this industry, such as developers, O&M providers, manufacturers, and things like that. So we really try to seek a lot of input in designing what the roadmap for research should be. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is pillar one. Again, sorry, the title seems to be missing, but the pillar one is really focused on technology for both fixed and floating offshore wind. So there are, for those of you that don't know, there are really two major buckets of technologies for offshore wind. One is fixed, where you have something that's adhered to the ocean floor, and then floating, which is exactly what it says, like more like floating systems, where things are on platforms that float out in the ocean. And these technologies are not necessarily new. They've been used in the oil and gas space for years, but now they're being adopted for offshore wind. And some of the challenges that we see and opportunity are to enable those larger wind turbines that I mentioned earlier, 15 to 20 megawatt turbines. Make sure we're building systems that have hurricane and other environmental extreme resiliency. Floating and fixed bottom array designs for the Great Lakes. So this isn't just ocean. We're also thinking about the Great Lakes. Power system design and innovation, unique aspects of that might be unique for offshore wind circumstances. So of course we have power systems on land, but there are some unique aspects out in the ocean that we need to think about. Energy storage integration, resilience, and reliability, and decommissioning, life extension, and infrastructure repowering. And this is kind of an interesting one because often people don't want to think about these things until we actually have the systems, deployed and operational. But we really need to start thinking about these things now, given the growth of the industry and the manufacturing that needs to take place, and think through the life cycle needs really of an offshore wind farm and how we might accommodate, things such as decommissioning. If you have to take a blade down or something like that, what are you going to do with that blade? So those are some things that need to be looked into in the future. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is our pillar 2. This has to do more, and I mentioned this earlier, with analysis of the actual ecosystem, what the wind productivity is or could be in certain areas, what the base of the ocean floor looks like, analysis that helps identify very specific data that developers and others can use, consultants can use, et cetera, to design the best systems, the systems that can be most efficient over time. And this often comes in the category of called physical site characterization. And for those of you that paid attention to New York Bight last week and the auctions, data such as this might be used for someone that's thinking about participating in such an auction. It's used later when people are designing their systems, and then it's used even again when they deploy, and then finally for operations and maintenance purposes in the future. Let's go to the next slide. The next 2 slides address pillar 3, which is really supply chain, logistics, and O&M. Here we have a few categories, so this will be 2 slides. First is installation, technology to reduce siting, construction, and operating conflicts, installation strategies for large turbines, O&M needs, which are digitization through advanced analytics. So this is things such as how can we collect data really efficiently once things are deployed and use that data to improve our operations and maintenance. So for example, before you send out a vessel with a number of repair crews, see if you can collect the data using data sensors, think about what's exactly needed and needs to be fixed or maintained so that you can efficiently deploy a crew or a vessel, et cetera, to address those needs. Large turbine and substructure testing methods, high sea state technical transfer solutions. So for example, if you need to send out a vessel with a crew, how can they transfer and do the work that they need to do safely? What vessel improvements might be needed or other things? O&M strategies and tools, and then floating wind operations and maintenance. Because floating is different, it will have different O&M challenges from fixed. And I'm not sure if I said this earlier or not, but there's been many more fixed systems deployed, and that's predominantly what's been deployed in Europe and elsewhere. So floating is new, and there are different O&M challenges there. And then on supply chain, we have technology solutions to accelerate the U.S. supply chain, industrialization of the floating supply chain, grid access, power systems, transmission upgrades, grid integration and market impacts, port designs, cost studies, and workforce deployment. So that kind of concludes the 3 pillars that we've identified in a roadmap. They might change in the future. That's just a guiding tool that we use really in short term to identify what we should be asking people for when it comes to making proposals to the consortium. Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, I apologize because it seems as though the banner titles are missing. The next few slides, I think there are 4 or 5 of them, identify the projects that we have awarded to date. So as I said, over the past few years, using the roadmap, we've issued competitive solicitation. As a result of those solicitations, we currently have under contract 46 projects, which is significant. I apologize, 40 of those are contracted, 6 are under negotiation right now. All of them are identified in here. And I'm going to just walk through at a very high level the categories of projects that are awarded thus far. I'm happy to answer high-level questions on each one of these. I should say that back in November, and we'll do it again this November, many of the projects actually presented and gave status updates and a little bit more detail about what they're doing at our Offshore Wind Symposium. It was virtual. I believe the recordings are still available online. So if you're specifically interested in the details of any of the projects that I'm going to show you today, you can look them up and actually hear the principal investigator describe their project at length. And there are materials there to read more about them through their PowerPoints. And you can get a better understanding of the work that they're doing. Ultimately, many of our projects, once they're concluded, or even while they're in process, much of the information and learnings that they have are shared publicly or with industry, so that we can actually gain those learnings and spread them and socialize them across the industry. So let's get started and go through some of these just kind of quickly. The first bucket here, we put these all in the bucket, is floating structure engineering. You can see we have around 10 projects that cover a wide range of topics in this space. Again, from institutions that might be academic institutions, private sector companies, or research entities such as NREL. Just to give an example, Esteco is working on a self-installation gravity-based substructure sizing for 15 megawatt turbines. This is, how are we going to hold up a 15 megawatt turbine when it's out? This is really looking at the floating structure that will be needed. In addition, we have a different kind of floating mechanism under the other Esteco process for the evolved spar concrete structures. Another example here is Triton's, anchoring system for a floating offshore wind system. So you can see a lot of these are focused on anchoring and moorings and what's needed to actually, really make sure that a floating system can really exist structurally out at sea. And let's go to our next slide, please. Other non-specific, meaning not specific to floating, are fixed structure engineering projects. These are more focused on the more traditional model that's been used in Europe, which are fixed structure for shallower waters. Stony Brook University has one, and we have one from Arcam Technologies that has to do with concrete and using concrete as a mooring and anchoring system, foundation concepts, and other using kind of experience from oil and gas platforms for large wind turbines. That's a deep reach technology project. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, we have two buckets here. I mentioned a little bit more extensively wind resource and site characterization, so you should have a good understanding of that. And you can see we have a couple of different institutions working on related projects for that. Under supply and logistics, I'll highlight the first project here, which is a supply chain roadmap. This is a fairly big study that we're sponsoring. The work is being done by National Renewable Energy Lab and the Business for Offshore Wind Network. Their first results will be published sometime later this year with a more exhaustive report and recommendations issued. I'm sorry, the first phase of the report will be issued this spring, a much larger report issued later this year. And this should really help identify where the gaps are nationally in our supply chain and what, in some areas, what we might do about them to address those. It's a very exhaustive study. A lot of kind of data collection has been done through interviews and analysis, and we're really looking forward to the release of that report. Let's go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, O&M and safety is an important area. Here we have a bunch of different projects that are looking at these things. Most of them really focus on collection of data in a way that reduces the man hours needed really to collect data, that allows you to collect things remotely and analyze it on site before you send out vessel crews, et cetera. That's not mutually exclusive to other things, but that's one of the areas that's gotten the most focus. And then, as I mentioned, we do have a category of projects under environmental and conflicting use or co-use. And this is looking at really innovations, hardware, and modeling to aid in that scientific research. And we have a couple key projects here. We just started the Envision project mentioned here, development priorities for scientifically robust, compatible wildlife monitoring. We have a project with Cornell University that's looking at right whale data collection and analysis and predictive tools. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then finally, I know I've given you a view of a lot of projects, is our electrical power systems projects. This has to do with grid system engineering, transmission, making sure that our export cables from the systems to the shore are using the most innovative technologies that they can withstand, extreme conditions, et cetera. So we have, a handful of projects here looking at a couple different things related to hardware. In addition, we have a few what I would call strategic studies, looking at how integration can occur and where interconnection points might work in the different markets across the U.S., both on the West Coast and on the East Coast. So two different types of projects here. Let's go to the next slide, please. So finally, I just thought I'd mention that we have a solicitation open right now. Concept papers are due March 9th. Concept papers are proposals that are 4 pages in length. Those concept papers will be reviewed, and then if they pass certain criteria, reach a certain threshold, full applications will be requested from those entities that submitted successful concept papers. We have 2 challenge areas that have been identified: facilitating ocean area coexistence and electrical and grid challenges unique to offshore wind transmission. The details of these are available on our website. You can see more details around each challenge area and the requirements for submission. We do encourage everyone to submit if they're interested. We are now, as I said, using concept papers to help really weed out the projects we think that might be most successful. And again, they're due next week. And I think that might be my last slide. Very good. So thanks for your time. I'm happy to take questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Carrie. I have a question while we wait for the the Q&As to roll in. You mentioned on one of your last slides a list of projects and specifically looking at how interconnection can occur and POI assessments around the country. I'm wondering, for these types of projects and studies, what is the time frame to conclude the studies? And given how dynamic and rapidly evolving the industry is, when we're looking to studies, what would you give as maybe a guideline?
That's
How many
great.
years, how many years is it valid for?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really good question that I didn't address. So I would say 2 things. One is, typically, although not always the case, we try to look for things that can be I would say used and useful or deployable, or the analysis can have an impact on deployment in the next 3 to 7 to 10 years. So we're not talking about innovations for 2035 or 2040. I wouldn't say that's always the case, but it's usually the case. And you'll see that in our roadmap as well. In terms of specific proposals, the projects themselves depend on the type of project. So we award feasibility studies for $300,000. We do demo studies for $800,000, and then bigger projects more along the commercialization line of over $1 million. Sometimes people do a combo too. But in terms of timing for those feasibility studies, it's 18 months. And then any project has to be completed within 36 months once it's awarded. So, I should say contracted, excuse me. So sometimes contracting takes a little bit of time. So really, we're looking for projects that can be wrapped up within the next 3 years. And the 3-year time frame is really only for those projects that are really a bit closer to an innovative or commercialized technology.
All right, thank you for that. Another one here is, I think you mentioned you have a solicitation live on the street. Will there be more research solicitations, or how are they determined if and when they're run?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for asking. Sure. We anticipate there will be more. I can never say for certain. We do have existing funding, remaining unused funding from some of our states. So we will be looking into topics in the next quarter, really, to think about how to best utilize those funds. And we are constantly looking to, what I would say, refill our research fund bucket as well. We've set this consortium up. We have a good structure, or at least the feedback is that it's a really good structure for facilitating this type of work and collaboration. And so we're seeking out new research funds as well for important topics. So I certainly expect us to issue more solicitations in the future.
Awesome. We have a question around any research or solutions looking at the challenges of availability of installation vessels. Is that something you also consider?
Yes, we have actually, and we have made awards in the past for those. So I didn't highlight those in the prior slides, but we do have a few vessel projects underway already. It's not the topic of the current solicitation because we kind of tackled it in one of the prior ones, but I think there are 2 or 3 that are specific to vessels. So yes, we do. And I should actually add to that, we certainly see vessel needs as critical in innovation and transformation of the existing fleet. The vessel need is really tremendous and almost overwhelming right now. We have a side project that's not necessarily related to research, but it is tied to facilitating this conversation with American Bureau of Shipping and the Loan Program Office out of DOE to talk about financing that innovation for vessels and transformation. So that's just a separate body of work that's happening that if someone's interested in, they can reach out to me about.
Awesome. No, we get a lot of questions around vessels. Another topic we get a lot of questions around, and I see one here is how is if and how the Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium is thinking about hydrogen.
Sure. Yeah. It's not a focus of ours, right, to do independently, but we would think about it within the context of combination with offshore wind deployment. So one of our challenge areas this time, you'll see, we mentioned grid resiliency and transmission. If, for example, we received a proposal where hydrogen was achievable and doable in the next 5 to 10 years and could tackle that question, we would consider it. But it's not a hydrogen, we're not issuing standalone hydrogen, solicitations or proposals right now. We are certainly thinking about the Department of Energy's anticipated FOA for regional hydrogen hubs and how offshore wind can play into that or participate in those. So that's a piece of work that we're working on with other entities, particularly in the Northeast and the state of New York. So.
Great. And can you speak a little bit to how you work with other research institutions internationally, given that this industry is pretty new in the US compared to other markets in Europe and in Asia?
Yeah, sure. First, I think I said this at the start, that our mission is US based. So all of our projects, research projects that are awarded are predominantly, well, they're all in the US. It doesn't mean it only has to be US companies. We do encourage collaboration. But we have a lot to learn from what's already happened in Europe with offshore wind deployment. And we've really tried to facilitate conversations with different institutions. Hopefully we'll do that with Asia as well as that market grows and we see the West Coast market in the US grow. We do have some informal relationships or formal relationship, as I said, with Innovate UK. We are working on a relationship with the Danish Technical University. And we've done some outreach with other institutions in Europe to kind of see where they're at. I guess one other point on that is the Carbon Trust and RCG are on our board, and they have extensive experience in Europe in this type of collaboration, and they have really deep knowledge on what other research projects are occurring in Europe, and we bring that information and knowledge to our own work so that we're not, let's say we're not awarding something that's already been done, and that we are awarding things where we've learned something somewhere else, that we pick up from that learning and include that in the projects, in the learnings that are going to happen with the things that we award. So I know that was a lot of words, but we do incorporate and think about that a lot to ensure that we're advancing, not doing the same thing.
No, absolutely. And for putting resources, put it towards, like you said, advancing, pushing the envelope.
Yep.
I have a follow-up question, a little bit more specific about hydrogen.
Sure.
Are there plans for hydrogen hybrid systems to be implemented, either direct production or tied into the local system on Long Island?
We have not awarded any projects as such, but I know people are thinking about that for sure. So, I don't want to speak on behalf of any developer, but if you look at some of the developers, let's just say Equinor, for example, they certainly have thought about this back in Europe. I expect them to bring that knowledge to bear here in the US. I'm not aware of any specific plans, but I certainly know that that experience elsewhere will be brought to the table in the US. And then second, as I said, we will certainly be looking at some of the Department of Energy opportunities to link the two up and to figure out how to really connect them in projects that can be either pilot projects or deployed projects.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have another follow-up around vessels, if you can speak to, which is, will service vessels be powered with clean renewable energy too? Is that part of the scope of what you look at?
It could be, yes. We have not funded any projects as such yet or have a specific solicitation, but certainly we have thought about it, and I know I have personally thought about it too. If we're going to grow a new vessel industry and, innovate with our vessels, let's try to make them as clean as possible. So while not done yet, I certainly anticipate that happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you speak to what is the Research and Development Consortium's approach to creating an inclusive, holistic offshore wind ecosystem?
I've been thinking about that a lot, and we are really seeking out opportunities to ensure that even at the, well, not even, but let me just step back very quickly. Industry is not just supply chain and people that work on the systems, which is, a huge part of industry, is deployment and construction, but research matters too, and so does innovation. And so my focus really, we're really thinking about how do we ensure that at all aspects of industry, we have some inclusivity, and that we really engage, communities, not just that are seeing, will be the home to offshore wind, but also are actually part of the research process too. And we're looking at some specific grants that are being offered by the Department of Energy to try to tackle that question. We certainly don't know everything, but I think my observation is now is the time to try to incorporate some of those metrics and goals in the work that we do.
Awesome. I got to tell you, we have so many different questions.
Okay, I know you're doing a great job, Layla. Sorry.
This was such an engaging presentation, and with like such a variety of questions, I think it just speaks to the reach of the work that you do. It's very interesting, touches a lot of people. See how I'll give you maybe a challenging one, which is, can you speak to how your research involves or is affected or impacted by politics or legislation makers at the state and even more local levels? How does that impact the work that you do?
That's a great question. We wouldn't exist without legislation, let's put it that way, and not specifically to the consortium, but the initial funding came through Department of Energy, which was, if you unwind that way back, is really from Congress. So, how Congress sets the Department of Energy budget or other budgets, related budgets, such as BOEM or what have you, ultimately would flow down to us. So that's the big picture, the macro picture. From another policy standpoint, the mandates that are being set or the goals that are being set at the state level, New York's goal, the federal government's goal, for 30 gigawatts by 2030, those goals really are accelerating the market. And at the end of the day, that impacts what we do and drives what we do. So those policies are very important. We wouldn't exist without those policies, because if you don't have a goal and you don't have a mandate, it's unlikely that these things would happen. And our job is to try to make them happen quickly, efficiently, and cost effectively, and to share that knowledge, to make sure that happens. So more specifically, it would be great to have more policies that focus on research and development. We don't have a lot that require, funding to go that way, or there's nothing that specific about the work we do, and that could certainly be more useful in the future as we start to see the markets and industry grow. And then finally, issues that come from local stakeholders certainly might drive some of the innovation that we look at, and is taken, when proposals come in, they often might include, like, we know this is a challenge in a local community. Can this innovation help solve that challenge? So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. What are some technical challenges that are unique to New York State?
I think the kind of the major ones are, it may be unique to the Northeast, but New York as part of the Northeast is, the busy ports that you have in the harbor, and both on Long Island and New York City area. Those ports are extremely busy. We're building an industry that's going to need to utilize those ports. There are technical challenges for figuring out how logistics are going to work, so that, we can both maintain existing industry and existing use for those ports at the same time as deploying, multiple vessels, major construction, changing port sites, et cetera, to really accommodate the growth in offshore wind. So I think that's something that's specific to New York or the Northeast, is really thinking about our port systems that are very active. They're also, places where certain businesses have existed for hundreds of years. And we have to take those things into consideration as we, design the logistics and the systems and the technology.
Right. And can you speak to what are some of the consortium's long-term plans for other programs or additional research topics? Where's the arc heading?
Yeah, we're in the stage right now where and I've said this as an answer to a lot of your questions. The consortium's been set up now for over 4 years. We've awarded, $30+ million and have that many, equal amount of 46 projects under our purview at the moment. And it's important time for us to think about what happens next. Not just because of where we are, but where the industry is, right? With awards being made in New York Bight, with power purchase agreements being signed, with deployment construction actually starting on Vineyard this year. It's not time to pivot, but it's also time to think about, what can the consortium do to help aid this project process. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, we're thinking about joint industry projects that might be more targeted research for certain solutions. We're thinking about really how we might help BOEM in the future with its work. What technologies do they need to help identify bite areas and all that kind of stuff. So thoughts are welcome.
Right. As we evolve, we're in a new stage of the industry. The research needs will evolve along with it. Yeah. 2 more questions. Where can folks learn more about each of the projects that you've mentioned here today? How can we follow up?
So I think, and if I think I have this right. We, as I mentioned, had a symposium in November. It was our second one. It was all virtual. Most of the projects that you saw today, unless they were recently contracted, but most of them had already been under contract, did full presentations at that, and those recordings are available online. So that's the best place to learn about the details of those projects. The PIs for those did 20-minute presentations and then did Q&A sessions describing the work they're doing, the results, the findings so far, and what the anticipated outcomes are. So those were posted in November. We'll do another one this November. And then, like anything, pay attention to our social media. We often provide project updates. We try to feature a project every 2 weeks and provide some updates on its activity and what they're doing. On LinkedIn, I should say.
I was going to say, do you get follow up? Do you know what your social media handles are?
I don't know. LinkedIn, you look up National Offshore Wind R&D Consortium. I should have included the links here. I apologize.
Okay, no worries. All right. And last question. We've got Long Island in the house. There's a specific question here. Do you have any advice for folks interested in engineers in particular, interested in working in research and development and product development on Long Island for offshore wind? And if so, can you speak to the private companies or institutions that might be a good place to investigate for folks wanting to get involved in the industry?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll do my best to answer it. There's a lot of work going on in Long Island, of course, because that is, one of the places where interconnection will occur and development will be based out of. So Stony Brook University, where actually our headquarters are, we're virtual at the moment, but, we do have an office there. The Advanced Energy Research Center, AERTC at Stony Brook is sort of a hub for all things, not just offshore wind, but clean tech on Long Island, from a kind of research standpoint. In addition, Farmington and Stony Brook, I think it's Farmington. Farmingdale, excuse me. Farmingdale and Stony Brook have certification programs or are working on certification programs. Farmingdale is doing an online program later this week. And it's not necessarily just about, construction. It's also about engineering opportunities and kind of where the needs are in this space. So I encourage people to check those places out, those institutions out, because they do have programs. And there are a number of small companies on Long Island, I know, that are looking to fill manufacturing gaps or other, consulting gaps in this space. And I would say really, those 2 universities kind of keep track of them, and they have all these forums that really connect people. So I encourage those, and I'm happy to answer more specific questions if someone had one on those.
All right. Thank you. As real time, as a follow-up, a participant has noted that they did participate in that offshore wind professional certification and already has a lot of good following up to do and really recommends that for anybody this year.
Great.
So thank you for mentioning.
We actually teach at that too. Myself and one of my colleagues had taught a couple courses there. So I think people will find not only it's a way to learn more, but also to connect with others and the companies that are in the space. So
Definitely. Thank you so much. All right, that seems to wrap us up. This was super interesting, and thank you so much for your time. And thank you to everyone watching for joining us in this Learning from the Experts webinar. As a reminder, the webinar recording and the presentation slides will be available at nyserda.ny.gov /OSW-webinar-series. Our next webinar in this series is on March 30th at 1 p.m. And Hannes Pfeifenberger with the Brattle Group will be speaking about offshore wind transmission in New York and in the region. So you can register for future webinars through our events page at wind.ny.gov. If you have questions for future topics you would like to hear about in this series, please email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov. Thank you all again, and thank you, Carrie, for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
thanks, Layla. Thanks all.